Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, that was a terrific panel. It's a great overview of how AI is affecting security, law enforcement, and intelligence gathering, and what some of the ethical and societal aspects of those areas are as well. So I think we heard a number of provocative thoughts. What our panel is going to do is to follow up on that conversation by seeing how AI is transforming a number of domestic fields. There have been important developments in transportation, healthcare, resource management, just to name a few areas. AI is creating tremendous opportunities and offering a number of interesting innovations. To help us understand this area, we are pleased to be joined by 4 leading experts. Martin Fleming is the Chief Analytics Officer and Chief Economist at IBM. In those positions, he leads the company's efforts on AI as well as cognitive analysis. Amir Khorashani is the Chief Technology Officer for AI products at Intel. He works on creating hardware and software for AI solutions. Carolyn Nguyen is Director of Technology Policy at Microsoft. And in that position, she looks at AI and digital governance. It's also nice to welcome her back to Brookings. Many years ago, she was a fellow here at the institution. And then finally, David Silverberg is Director of Large-Scale Analytics at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Lab. And there he employs large-scale data systems and data science to improve analysis and decision-making. And I do want to note that Intel and Microsoft support the work of Brookings, and we are grateful for that support. So I want to start with Martin. What do you see as the most promising AI applications in the domestic area?
Well, certainly the technology industry itself, a bit of a bootstrap operation, is perhaps the industry where most applications have advanced the furthest to date. Then thinking about financial services, where there's a great deal of activity underway. Financial services is a close cousin of the technology industry. But even in the large, well-known financial services firms that I speak to regularly, still exploring opportunities and potential and building capabilities. Probably tied with financial services is healthcare. An enormous amount of work underway in the healthcare space. IBM, for example, in our applications, we have helped provide care for about 55,000 patients at this point. It's a large number, but still a small percentage of the U.S. or the global population. When we look at, for instance, the work that's been done at UNC to test and place some trials in the AI Watson capabilities, very interesting and promising results. The recent meeting of the American Society of Clinical Oncologists had a number of very interesting solutions being experimented with as well. Beyond those industries, then, more broadly, I think of it as more in a functional space. The whole area of sales and marketing, which is data rich, both in the business-to-business and the business-to-consumer environment, is one where there's an enormous number of applications that are beginning to emerge, and we all experience them to some degree as consumers of Netflix and Amazon's capability and others. The supply chain area, again, a data-rich, functional area where there's been some significant progress made. And then finally, I would say in the human resources space, of course, facing some significant challenges because of concerns around privacy and confidentiality, but still a place where there's been some pretty good progress. So that's the landscape as I see it today.
Okay, thank you. So Amir, I know you work a lot on transportation solutions and autonomous vehicles in particular. What initiatives do you have underway in those areas?
So autonomous driving, driver's assist, entails lots and lots of interesting technology, all the way from building processors for cars, for other autonomous vehicles, and hardening them, making them robust to work in this kind of adverse environment as your car has to sustain extremes of temperature and so forth. So beyond processors, there's algorithms for doing the AI of these systems, doing mapping, doing computer vision, doing things like sensor fusion, route planning. These are all quite involved. But it's not just in the car. The technology is also in the data center. If you're managing a fleet of 10,000 cars, there's a lot of systems level machine learning and AI that's involved in that. Each car is recording on the order of 4 terabytes of data per day, and just managing the data, analyzing it, running machine learning algorithms from this data and extracting knowledge is a really interesting engineering task. As well as the communication between cars and cars with the data center using 5G technology, for example, is another thing we're investing in. That's also really interesting. How do you communicate between the edge and the data center?
Okay, David, so Amir mentioned all this extraordinary amount of data that is being created. You study large-scale data analytics. How are they being deployed to improve decision-making?
So there's a lot of advances coming from the university and also the labs from many of the outstanding companies that are producing AI. So our job is to really deploy the analytics. And when we deploy analytics, there's really 2 aspects of it that I consider. There's the engineering of analytics and there's the art of analytics. So from the engineering perspective, it's important to not understand just AI all on its own. It has to work within a large system and systems of systems where people are in the loop and there's a particular goal that needs to be achieved. So it has to be understood in the context of an end-to-end perspective. Also, AI is not AI, or the same thing for machine learning. If you open a machine learning textbook, there are hundreds of algorithms. Understanding the right algorithms for the right job is very important, and understanding how they need to be composed and how they need to be used is extremely critical in an organization or when you're laying out any kind of large data system. And so to that end, understanding not only the technology of how to integrate a system, but also understanding the science of data analytics and how to pull the different algorithms together to achieve the goals you want to achieve. There's also a level of explainability. So some systems need to be explainable, others do not. So there's various technologies that range from the broad spectrum of easily explainable, such as like expert systems, to deep learning, which is very explicable in many ways. So understanding the requirements of the human in the loop is very important.
Carolyn, what are the AI applications that you think offer the greatest hope?
Great. Thanks so much, Daryl, and thank you for enabling me to be a part of this panel. Just want to, it's kind of interesting that we've had this discussion in AI and we haven't really defined what it is, so I'll just say what I think, how we use it, which is, AI helps to detect patterns, which can then help to make predictions and recommendations. And looking at it from that perspective, it has the ability to enhance any decision-making process in any sector. So as a tool, I think it can be applied everywhere, and we think of it from that perspective as computational intelligence. I'll just use 3 examples. One is in healthcare. So in terms of today's issues, an Institute of Medicine study that was released in 2016 said that the 3rd leading cause of death in the US is misdiagnosis. And so one of the things that we're doing is actually working with Johns Hopkins to improve healthcare, patient care in the ICU to identify anomalous treatments and also interoperability of systems. Something very, very basic. But in terms of going forward, in radiology, it is estimated that half the people over 60 will develop cancer at some point during their lives, and half of those people will need radiotherapy. So one of the things is that our computer scientists are working with radiation oncologists as well as surgeons and other experts to try to figure out what's the best way to identify and delineate tumors from nearby organs in three-dimensional radiological x-rays. I use that example a lot because I think that's a perfect example in terms of thinking about AI augmenting human abilities and capabilities. In other words, enabling subject matter experts to enable and create leapfrogs in each of their fields, and that's how we're really thinking about this. In terms of statistics, if you use AI alone in terms of radiology, it's got a 92% accuracy. Radiologists have about a 94% of accuracy. When you combine the two, you can get to something like a 99.5%. Again, these are the kinds of scenarios and applications that we think about as a tools development. The second area I want to talk about is really how AI addresses sustainability issues. So for example, in precision farming, we talk some of this about the use of sensors, drones, et cetera, to enable data-driven farming. And so the notion is that with that data, a farmer anywhere can understand what's the soil condition, what's the water, what's the landscape look like, and it can improve farming productivity. The estimate is that food productivity could improve up to 67%. That's a major achievement and a step forward when you start to think about the fact that human population will increase by about 2.5 billion over the next quarter century. So these are some of the ways that we're looking at it. And in terms of that, as a company, we launched AI for Earth, which is a $50 million grant program over 5 years that addresses agriculture, water, biodiversity, and climate change. And thus far, the program launched last year, we've funded something like 110 grantees over 27 countries. The third area I want to bring up is AI for accessibility and inclusivity. As a technology, AI can empower people to be really more a part of their professional, their society, etc. So a very simple example, we developed an application called Seeing AI. It sits on my mobile phone, and it describes to people kind of what's going on in the meetings, what's the reaction of the people around you. This is for visually impaired people. What's the scene on the street? It helps you to read menus and also identify what are the products. So these are some of the ways in which we really think about how AI can transform lives and improve societies, overall.
Terrific. So we've heard many innovations taking place in healthcare and finance, transportation, and accessibility. So I'm curious, what do each of you see as the greatest barriers to making progress in AI in these various ways? And how can we think about overcoming those challenges? Martin, we'll start with you.
People. In a business organization, changing behavior is the most challenging. We all show up for work every day and expect we're going to do the same thing the next day we did the previous day. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work that way. So the challenge is to be able to create the tools that are necessary to help improve the productivity and the ability of workers to continue to grow their incomes, but allow them to adopt the tools and understand what's needed in terms of training and education, and being able to work in very different ways. I can take you through a number of examples if we like, but it's really the adoption and the deployment as much as it is the technology and the engineering itself.
Okay. Amir, what do you see as the greatest obstacles?
So some of the things we work on at Intel are making algorithms more explainable, transparent, developing algorithms that are privacy aware, that don't need to expose your data potentially to a nefarious actor. Other issues we're working in around are adoption. So the technology has particular features that makes it very difficult to adopt. It's very computationally intensive. It requires infrastructure that's specialized for machine learning AI, from storage to communication to the compute requires new kinds of processor technologies, as well as helping companies get their heads around deploying robust, scalable, power-efficient AI systems is quite a challenge. So the theory and math behind neural networks is relatively simple, but to get a system deployed in an enterprise or in another situation is quite challenging. So those are some of the main things we work on. Algorithms, systems level AI, making it easily adoptable. And also my presence here is sometimes questioning some of the notions I hear about how the current version of AI is a black box. I don't think that's actually true. And the research community has been a really good steward for this technology. So if you go to a machine learning conference where lots of academics are present, you see people talking about jobs and diversity and security and privacy. So I think we're very forward-looking as a community, and we're becoming more and more involved in public policy settings such as the Brookings.
David?
So I say there's two obstacles. Number one, as data gets larger and as algorithms get more complex, so there's just an inherent limit to the size of the data and the machines that can process the data. So there's just a theoretical computational complexity that needs to be overcome, and that really is overcome by increasing system size and perhaps innovation in algorithms and heuristics. But I think even probably the bigger obstacle might be is worrying about sort of the overhyping of AI and machine learning. So it seems to be a buzzword. Everybody's looking for it today, and I hear it more and more. Even over the last year, the amount that I hear about AI and machine learning from potential users, potential people that are going to be employing these systems or want to employ these systems, it seems to be this magic word that's going to overcome everything. And it's very important to understand what all of these AI techniques are, machine learning techniques are, what they can achieve, and what's not achievable, and what's achievable through a lot of work. And when we get a realistic perspective on it, then we understand what we're employing, and we'll have realistic expectations. The fear is that it'll become hyped to such an extent that it can solve everything. In reality, it'll solve many things, but it won't. We just got to make sure to match expectations with real outcome.
Carol?
I'll build upon the point that was just made by David, which is that there's not a lot of clear understanding on what the technology is, what it can do. At the end of the day, technology, it automates what we're already doing today, and that's really the extent of the technology. But to answer your question specifically, what are the barriers to AI? I think it is people from two different aspects. One is it needs to be trusted. It needs to be trustworthy in terms of the design, development, deployment, and adoption of this technology. Unless the technology is perceived to be trustworthy, it won't be able to be adopted to the extent that it can really achieve the potential of some of the applications that I mentioned earlier. And from that perspective, the discussion this morning with respect to principles is very interesting, from the perspective of, these needs to be values. As a global company, we need to think about ethics, but from a very different perspective, because ethics is a social cultural construction. It is social cultural norms also. And so it needs to be timeless values that is applicable and can be applicable, in multiple countries. The second aspect of this is that we do need to make sure that we have the appropriate people involved in the development of these applications in a way that is trustworthy. So that's capacity building, that's work skills, that's, so there's a second conversation there about developing the ability of people to develop these kind of applications that will be relevant and can deliver trustworthy services.
So David mentioned the risk of overhyping. Carolyn, in her first comment, talked about the need for inclusivity. So in thinking about the ramifications for workers and society in general, people worry that AI is going to take jobs, increase inequality, and be biased in the way that it makes decisions. Should we be worried about AI? Martin?
Sure, we should, yes. The whole issue of the future of work that you've written about quite eloquently and at great length is one that is certainly very pressing issue. My view is that on the one hand, the broad societal attitudes have been very much shaped by the technology that we've seen deployed over the last several decades, largely in the manufacturing space around robotics, which is the old technology. It's a rules-based technology where the robot encounters a condition and reacts in some pre-specified way. This is a very different technology that's being applied in very different spaces. We've talked about healthcare. Both Carolyn and I have used illustrations in that space. We've talked about financial services. We are all, as consumers, use the capabilities every day. When we're typing a text message and the word comes up that you're trying to type, quick type, that's an artificial intelligence application. So we see how the benefits are beginning to be apparent. So the impact on employment will be fundamentally different from the robotics technology, which is designed to replace employees, to a technology that's designed to enhance productivity. I would never suggest that there will be no jobs lost as a result of the deployment of artificial intelligence solutions. That will be the case, and it will differ significantly by geographies in the developing world versus the developed world. But it's a very different technology. We'll have very different implications for the future of work.
Amir?
So the promise of AI, I think, in the near term and potentially 5 years out is to, as Carolyn and others have mentioned, is augmenting and working alongside humans. If you're immersed in this field like I am, building solutions, AI-based solutions, it's quite hard to, some of the simplest things like picking up a glass off a table is quite difficult for a robot to do, for example. So and even in areas such as radiology, you see in the press, you see a lot of hype around automated tumor detection systems and so forth. Is this going to replace radiologists? It won't. It will just augment. It'll be just another tool that they will get to use. That'll improve their performance. And I think this will go on for the next 3 to 5 years. Some of the tasks for the standard example in robotics is Amazon automated its data centers, and what did it do to employment? It increased. Amazon has increased employment in its in its warehouses by 300,000 people. So automate the warehouse. It did not eliminate jobs. Actually, they have many more jobs in the warehouse. And this is true in all across AI applications, even in law and going through large corpora of text. You basically, the biggest promise of the latest neural networks and AI technology is to augment humans and work alongside them. So I would like to act as a counterpoint to this belief that AI is going to replace jobs, but as you've written in your book, there are certain parts of the population that are very susceptible to being replaced, and that's something that's a very big public policy question that we need to address.
David?
So I'll agree with both Martin and Amir. Yes and no. So yes, it is something to worry about. But again, it's you have to understand what you're building and what you're using. So if you're talking about automation in cars, you're subject to cyber attacks on your cars or other types of equipment that you're enabling with AI. On the other hand, it's an augmenting tool. If you use it correctly, it can actually, just as Carolyn mentioned before, you can actually improve the accuracy of diagnoses of diseases. And ultimately, like any tool could be used for the better or for the worse. But if you use it correctly, you'll be able to improve productivity of people that are now perhaps taking many hours to achieve a task, can now achieve many more tasks in the same amount of time with augmentation from AI.
Carol, your view on these issues?
So we very much think about AI from a human-centered perspective. And on this question, we think about it the same way, which is that AI will impact jobs, both the nature of the kinds of jobs as well as the nature of work itself. And so what's really important is to be human-centered about this, and how do we work with people who will be impacted, first of all, to make sure that they're trained appropriately. So just to share with you some statistics, right? Something about the fact that 65% of children entering primary schools today will end up working in completely new job types that don't yet exist. about 50% of the subject knowledge acquired during the first year of a 4-year technical degree is outdated by the time students graduate. So there are some fundamental changes that's happening both in terms of the types of jobs that's being available, as well as the kind of work environment. For example, some of the crowdsourced work. So from that perspective, I think that's where we need to be paying a lot of attention, which is, from the elementary and primary schools up to teach STEM skills. That doesn't mean just math and science, but the ability to think critically, the ability to have empathy, the ability to have collaborative work, those kinds of things, and the ability to adapt and have flexibility to change, because we know that skills needed will change. So this also has implication, for example, in education programs. It's no longer just a 4-year university degree, but it's about how can we use AI to identify the kind of skills that will be needed, and then how can we use AI to provide training? How can we use AI to look at different career pathways? So a lot of the time we talk about AI as a problem, but I think AI really needs to be looked at as also part of the solution. So I wanted to put that out there as well. But it's very important to be focused on the human. It's human-centered rather than, we can argue about what's a net job loss or the net job gain. Let's focus on the human in this new AI-driven society.
Okay, one more question, then we'll open the floor to questions and comments from the audience. And the question is, who should decide on the future of AI? Right now, America is pretty libertarian in its approach to emerging technologies. Companies have a lot of leeway to deploy new solutions. Should we stick with this general approach? Do we need new laws, new regulations, or new ways of thinking about it?
So we heard a little bit in the previous panel the view that it's a bit too soon to understand specifically the legislative and legal changes that might be required. I think there's certainly some truth to that. But I do think what's important is that each of our organizations, and I know we all are, have our own set of ethics and principles that we adhere to. From an IBM perspective, we're very much focused on on 3 principles, really, that artificial intelligence is intended to augment human intelligence. Number 2, that the data and the insights that we have belong to the creators of the data, which is, I know, a controversial statement these days, given the public discourse that's underway. And number 3, the focus on continuing to build skills and the development of capabilities, much as Carolyn was alluding to. So we have a very strong focus on the ethics and the principles that underlie the deployment of AI solutions and what that means in terms of their applications.
Amir?
So I agree with your statement. I would like to reinforce that what's really nice and why I'm so optimistic about this incredible explosion in the use and development of AI is that the academic and research community, which is largely driving this, has been very forward-looking, and this is clearly evident in conferences you go to. At academic conferences, you usually have talks by researchers about algorithms and innovations, but in the last 2 major conferences in AI that I've gone to, there's been a lot of attention spent on how AI will influence work, how do you address privacy issues, how do you make your models more transparent, how do you make them more robust to adversarial attacks. And it's quite surprising how forward-looking, how good a steward the academic and research community is in this area. And many of the large mindshare holders in the research community are actually at places like Microsoft, Intel, Google, and others. And again, at these companies, there's a strong impetus driven by the researchers to be really good stewards of the technology and be self-regulating. So I'm actually very optimistic, and I think, again, the people who created the technology are also really cognizant of public policy issues. So that's somewhat unusual, I think, in research.
David, should we continue the current approach?
Yeah, I think ultimately it'll be the public that decides how it gets implemented. We have great stewards, as you say, from some of the top organizations, top research organizations, and also top academics. People want to do the right thing, and people want to help society for 99% of the people that work in this area. It'll be a matter of understanding what's accepted by the public, what's usable by the public, how it enhances their life. And if there are abuses, there will be policy recriminations for that, and people will come back and start with legislation to address those abuses. But I think for now, people are doing the right thing, and they're achieving great goals.
Carol.
So this morning there was a lot of conversation around shared dialogues. As a company, we strongly believe in that there needs to be dialogues between policy stakeholders, the academic community, business, civil society, together, because each of us bring a particular perspective to the issue. Civil society can bring up and raise issues with regards to human rights, for example. The academic community can help us think about, what's the way in which technology can be a part of the solution, and we work together very closely with the academic community, and then government can identify what are the policy issues. And I think there was an earlier question today that says, is it too late? I think in AI, we're actually doing this at the right time. The technology is still developing. There's huge opportunities to shape the way that it's developed further. And we all really need to be at the table and contribute to this conversation. So it needs to be a multi-stakeholder conversation. It also needs to be an interdisciplinary conversations. And that's where we can start to identify what are some of those unintended consequences as the system is being designed, architected, and deployed. There also needs to be a lot of sharing of best practices, and that's why we've formed the organizations such as Partnership on AI. And the notion is, how can we share practices on these very, very difficult issues, such as safety and reliability, transparency and accountability, inclusiveness, security and privacy, and also how do we address the issue of bias, right? Fairness is sort of what do you do once you identify bias? And is that bias inherent within society, or is that bias a part of the, as Susan pointed out earlier, a function of the data set that you've chosen? So I think this really needs to be a multi-stakeholder conversation and wide-ranging dialogue. But I think that at the same time, the U.S. is also not as active with respect to AI policy discussions as other countries in the world. And I think that's something where we need to really have a strong conversation with respect to how do we establish competitiveness in this area, and furthermore, longer-term research on some of the issues. There are reports and recommendations on this that I think really needs to be acted upon.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions and comments from you. There's a gentleman right here who has a question. And give us your name and organization.
I'm Steve Winters, independent consultant. I just wanted to, I'm not an expert on AI, but I do try to follow the discussion. So, for example, I wonder if you're being too hopeful as a whole on the panel. The issue of keeping the humans in the loop. So I'd like to get the reaction to the other argument that's made. For example, the radiologist case that you mentioned. Probably today that's absolutely true. The radiologist plus the automated reading of the X-ray or whatever is better than either one alone. But in other cases, things have moved along. For example, in chess playing computers, there was a time when the chess playing computer plus a chess expert was better than just the chess playing computer. But now that the algorithms for the chess playing computer have improved, if the human gets involved in the current chess-playing computer, he actually makes the result worse. Same thing with Go. The Go was originally based on the machine. Putting in all the human experience with Go as part of the training. The current version of the machine finds that if you put in all human experience on Go, it actually makes the end result worse than the machine they have.
Okay,
so the tendency...
Can we get your question?
There's a lot of evidence that says that the humans are going to be out of the loop as things develop.
Can I try?
Sure.
I don't know how many Go players there are in the world, but let me share with you the little I know about the radiology profession. There, first of all, are a very, very large number of images being produced on a daily basis globally. To the extent when I talk to my colleagues in the radiology profession, the concern is the ability of radiologists to keep pace not just with reading the images that are being produced, but to provide the appropriate clinical diagnosis for patient care. So the ability to provide greater productivity to the radiologist is enhancing the care delivered to the patient as a result of being able to focus on those images which provide the greatest risk. Carolyn put it well, talking about pattern recognition, recommendations, and prediction, and that's what the tools of radiology are intended to do. The second aspect around radiology is the demographics of the profession. Demographically, the world is challenged generally. We're getting older. Labor forces are growing more slowly, and it's impacting the medical profession just as it is every other profession. Some of my radiologist friends will say, it's not just the total number, but it's the geographic distribution. There are more radiologists in the street where the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute is in Boston than in all of the country of Tanzania. So being able to provide the care globally and clinically appears to have a significant probability of being enhanced with the tools of radiology.
So there's a really excellent article on, following up on the radiologist thread by Eric Brynjolfsson in February issue of Science. You're probably familiar with it. And what he and his co-author do in this report is they go through a wide variety of use cases of AI and how much the machine learning technology will be able to replace the human. And it was quite surprising to me that even in the area of radiology, I study computer vision and I work on volumetric data sets and MRI images and all sorts of things. It's quite unintuitive that the machine learning is actually a small part of the task of a radiologist. That some of the things that are really difficult are communicating with the patient, just the common sense aspects in addition to the things that you mentioned that AI cannot replace. And I think in cases where there's fear of AI replacing a person, I think it's important to go and look at actually all the tasks that are involved in the case of a radiologist, not just looking at the images and detecting a tumor, but all the things that it entails being a radiologist. It's surprising, and that it actually cannot be replaced by an AI.
Right, here's a question. There's a microphone coming over to you.
Good morning. My name is Nicholas. I lead the Future Society. Thank you so much for a very insightful conversation. I'd like to build upon your last point, which is that when this relationship between substitution and enhancement is engaged, and it is engaged, how do we look at the fact that what we may be replacing is, in terms of tasks within an occupation, is a highly productive task, which generates a lot of value, which get transferred. The case of the radiologist is a very interesting case in point, because what remains, which the machines have not been able to replace, is something that could be in the current, I would say, economic paradigm, judged as low value. And therefore, in terms of value, you can translate that into wage and therefore income. I know it's not a question, I'm asking this because it's a big question. I know, how do we, from a policy perspective and from a corporate social responsibility perspective, that too at a scale which seems to be a bit more global than it is local, as you have pointed out, Microsoft serves global consumers and not US citizens. How do you see that problem arising? And how would you address it from a CSR perspective and from a broader governance perspective?
Good question. Carol?
So, I think that there is no one answer to that question, because a lot of what so there's 2 points that you're making, so let me just make sure that I repeat it. One is that you're saying that AI can replace tasks that are meant for automation, which would then increase the value of more the human side aspect of the task. And that I completely agree with you. Now, I think in terms of being able to ensure that those tasks get highly valued and that and it's deployed in such ways, and that these professions really get the value that they deserve worldwide, I think these are conversations that we need to have, with in the different countries that we are involved in. But we're completely in agreement with you that AI automates tasks. and not jobs at this point in time. And that's why in terms of education, it's going to be really, really important to emphasize what are the human qualities. What's the way in which people can collaborate better, can look at alternative solutions, et cetera. And then also to answer the gentleman's question earlier, these are systems, and there needs to be, especially when they're deployed in sensitive applications such as radiology, financial services, employment decisions, etc., there needs to be appropriate governance level involved to ensure that we really do truly understand what is it that the system delivers. What is its value of false positive as well as false negative, and all of those really need to be taken into consideration as part of the governance of deploying these systems. There's a tendency that says, it's a technology, so it knows it all, and it's better than human beings. It's not. It is just a tool. It's a computational tool that needs to be a part of, I think you used the term ecosystem.
David?
So, yeah, I'll agree with the panelists here. I think it's ultimately comes down to accountability and responsibility. So, for example, a program like AlphaGo or Deep Blue or something like that, there are very little consequences to that machine losing a game of Go or chess. However, if you go to an oncologist and they come up with using machine learning entirely, and they make a false prediction because there are always false positives and true negatives, and they decide not to insert themselves in the loop, they are ultimately responsible. So ultimately, it really depends on who you go to, and ultimately somebody taking responsibility. And as Amir said, it's an end-to-end system. AI is placed in different parts of the end-to-end system, but people need to control the system. And at this point, there's not an end-to-end AI system that controls everything.
So, for the rest of the audience, you're referencing two pieces of research that I'm sure you know well. One is the work that David Artur and his collaborators have started actually many years ago, distinguishing between occupations, which a relatively stable structure over time, and tasks within those occupations, which tend to change at some given rate and pace. Recent work by Darren Asamoglu has begun to look at how those tasks get expanded or contracted over time. The other body of work is Jim Besson's work at Boston University, where he talks about the remainder principle, that there are certain tasks that are automated as each technology epoch comes along, but there are certain tasks which cannot be automated, either because of the technology itself or because of the business case, the incremental value of the last bit of automation. And so the debate is, to frame the debate, is what is the value of those last unautomatable tasks which require the human effort. Some would assert that that's where the human effort achieves its greatest value in terms of reward. Jim Besson's work has shown historically it has taken time for the labor market to adjust and provide the higher levels of compensation. But we're certainly funding a lot of research in this exact space with David and Eric, Ron Olafson, and Jim as well, to understand these labor market dynamics and how they're beginning to roll out over time.
Other questions? In the very back? Actually, there's a microphone coming over to you.
Hi, you had mentioned something about robots being unable to pick up a cup, and I was wondering if you were familiar with Hanson Robotics and Sophie and other companies such as SoftBank and Italia. I think that may be a misunderstanding. I think that robots are there, and we're talking about humanoid robots. And I'm wondering if there's a way to fit humanoid robots into the conversation, as well as augmentation, human augmentation, and the incorporation of neurotechnologies or nanotechnologies into the body that would or could augment the human mind or destroy the human mind. That would be artificially unintelligent, something that could make us something that could block firing between signals and therefore be used to depress the human mind. Thank you.
Is that addressed to me? So on the question of picking up a glass of water, my point there was that it's non-intuitive how difficult that task is. There are robots that can do things like pick and place, but again, we're still very early on, and these settings are really difficult. Again, robotics has come along quite a ways, but if you go on YouTube and look at the latest robotics competition, where many of the best academic labs come representing their robots, and the robots have to do simple tasks like get out of a car and open a door. Just look at the YouTube videos. It's lots of hilarity ensues when a robot tries to do that. And I'm not deriding it. I'd like to point out that these tasks are incredibly difficult, and we take them for granted. We don't know what we know. It's Polanyi's paradox. On the questions of incorporating robotics into the mind, and I am a neuroscientist by training, and I'm specialized in computer vision, and we did a lot of work in trying to figure out how the brain does processing and vision and motor cortex and other areas that could be relevant to enhancement by robotics. And I would say in neuroscience, we're even earlier on than in the AI space. This is one of the reasons I switched fields, because it was so hard. We don't have enough understanding of how the brain works to actually do things like what Elon Musk is potentially doing by sticking something into your carotid artery and it goes into your brain and something incredible happens. We don't even have a basic understanding of how the early vision works, how I detect this, my hand moving in front of my eye. Even that is largely unknown. So I think it's just too early on to address these questions. I know you disagree, but I've been there. I studied neuroscience for 8 years. It was. Absolutely, I agree with that.
Actually, can you use the microphone just so our webcast audience can hear your question?
We are very libertarian, unfortunately, in this area. We know that if you're a capitalist, you want to have your laboratory, you can. And you can do research, and you don't have to share it with anyone. You can go overseas. You can develop whatever you'd like in Hong Kong. Maybe you're in Taiwan. Maybe you're somewhere in Finland. But we know that we are behind in this country, and we know that we're not hearing what we should be hearing. And you are in a huge multinational company. You have a lot of information, and it's not being shared. YouTube is not the source for educated minds. We know we're not the only. We have a Silicon Valley, and so does Russia, and so do many other nation states. We need to hear that information. We need to know where we are. We need to be able to protect our biologies and all of the technologies that we are required to interact with on a day-to-day basis. We were just hearing earlier how vulnerable we are to cyber attack. Why would we invite AI into our industries at the level that we will be and have been, considering how subject we are to attack?
Okay. Any responses to that? People who are skeptical of what you're saying, what would you say to them?
So I think we're not as advanced as you may think we are. It ultimately comes down to fundamentals, really fundamentals of math and computer science. There's improvement, there's constant improvement, and there's constant refinement and constant new approaches. But we're just not there yet.
Carol?
I want to come back to the need to have a lot of these dialogues, right? In many ways, people say, well, what happens if superintelligence is here? The way I look at it is that we're part of shaping that future. We're part of, of creating that future. So the more that we can talk, the more that we can create solutions that can counter whatever are the issues that are being seen. So I just want to come back to that, because if technology can create can have unintended consequences, technology can also be created to detect those unintended consequences and mitigate them and address them. And that's one part of the conversation. That's why I do want to go back to the importance of having those dialogues at this point in time with everyone, with all of the different stakeholders at the table.
And I just wanted to repeat the comment I made earlier around the commitment that we have as an organization to ethics, privacy, confidentiality, and skill development.
Okay. Right here, this gentleman.
My name is Kumar, and I was in research and development with DuPont till I retired. And I can see AI applications in applied research. Do you think AI can ever do any creative work like basic research?
Potentially answer that. So, in the area of AI, there is an area of called generative models. So, the machine learning today is taking lots of data, understanding the statistical properties of this data, and being able to do certain things from this data. Doing inferences, telling whether a cat or a dog is in an image. But one of the things you can do is you can actually sample from these distributions, and you can hallucinate. So if you have a very good understanding of the visual world, if you have a good model for the visual world, you can actually ask your model to hallucinate the scene, a face of a celebrity, even voices of different languages and dialects. So, and then there's also artists who are getting involved in using generative models, they're called, to create art, to sample from these distributions, and it's quite remarkable what you can generate. And it can actually be applied to engineering. Someone made a heat transformer using a generative model that had this really intricate and non-intuitive structure, how to dissipate heat efficiently. So a combination of engineering and art.
So I'll just say, just to add to Amir's comments, there's a whole area of reinforcement learning, and it goes back to games like AlphaGo, where they play themselves and they learn strategy, and they develop strategy beyond humans, what humans had thought of previously. So, so computers are learning, and they're learning how to learn, and they're learning to be creative.
In the very back, there's a gentleman with his hand up. Yeah, there's a microphone coming up from behind you.
Thanks. Josh Freeman from AAAS. Amir, I have a question for you in your space. There's obviously been a lot of conversation about the AI competition between the U.S. and China, and today, both on this panel and the previous one, there's also been a lot of conversation about differing levels of responsibility and accountability in AI. Do you have any concerns that the way we attribute responsibility and accountability here in the U.S. might actually slow the progress from semi-autonomous and sensor-aided vehicles towards full autonomy in a way that it might not in China, in a way that actually enables China to gain the learnings around autonomous vehicles much faster than we will here?
I'm going to have to defer that to someone else on the panel. Maybe I can fill it in. I mean, I can make an answer. It's an excellent question. So are companies in China, for example, startups in China, less hindered than companies in the U.S.? I'm not sure that's really the bottleneck for AI progressing. It's quite a challenge. Again, I talked about picking up a class or driving a car. There's quite a lot of challenges that we face as engineers and systems developers and solutions developers that don't have to do with limitations imposed on us by regulatory bodies and so forth. I'd like to just answer that part of it, but anyone else have comments?
Well, maybe I can address that part, because we've done papers on driverless cars in the United States and China, and interviewed people in China on this. And it's interesting in the sense that when you think about the policy and regulatory challenges here on autonomous vehicles, the problem for the manufacturers is much of the transportation space is regulated at the local and state levels in terms of how you define drivers and what the rules are. And so American federalism creates a complication in terms of states having very different kinds of rules. In China, the issue is not so much federalism, but they have about a dozen different national agencies that regulate differing parts of the autonomous driving space. And the people there complain about these agencies and the government oversight, and it's limiting innovation, and they have to get permission from so many different people. Many of the Chinese companies actually are now doing their road testing in California because they cannot get permission to do the road testing in Beijing and Shanghai. There are off-road testing that's going on there, but not here. So there are challenges in different places that are going to complicate the path going forward. I think we have time for one more question. There's a gentleman right near the back there.
Hi, my name is Caleb Kostreva, and I'm from the 21st Century Wilberforce
Can you
Initiative.
speak up just a little bit so I can hear you?
Yeah. And my question is actually related to China issues. It's been mentioned a number of times using AI tech for privacy, and in China, obviously, there's a lot of censorship going on, and recently they made it illegal to use VPNs. How are technologies being created and developed to sort of circumvent the human rights and censorship kind of opportunities that are existing in some of these more authoritarian states?
Well, I'll make, again, one quick comment on that. China is certainly moving forward with a number of emerging technologies, but one in particular is the use of facial recognition software combined with AI systems and combined with video cameras. So there's a fascinating example just more than a month ago of a guy who the police were looking for. He knew the police was looking for them, so he's kind of laying low, not really leaving his house too much. But one weekend in his hometown, there was a concert with 75,000 people. He assumed he could go to this concert, not recognizing that the combination of the cameras, the AI, and the facial recognition software, they could find him out of the crowd of 75,000 people, which they did, and they arrested him. So that's kind of a very vivid demonstration of how they are pushing the envelope, employing AI into law enforcement. Here we use it, but we often use it after the fact. Like, you know, if there's a terrorist attack, then we go back, look at the cameras, find the suspect, and arrest that person. We're not so much doing it before the fact. There is controversy over the use of predictive analytics, but you know, kind of our approach is still pretty different from how they're doing it. I think we are out of time, but I want to thank our panelists for a terrific set of insights. I want to thank Martin, Amur, Carolyn, and David. Thank you very much for sharing your comments with us.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.